Welcome to the Beneath the Transaction podcast. I'm your host, Chris Pineda, and we have a great guest today. I'm here with Alix Prassas. We connected on LinkedIn because I've been on this pursuit to find people that have had to learn the hard way, the non-sexy way of what creates
Yes.
culture change beneath the transaction. I mean, the transactions those are the easy things to do. Those are going through the
Mhm.
motions, checking the boxes, but culture really transforms beneath the surface. And that's what I'm interested in. I've worked with a lot of different organizations and leaders in doing this. There's not a one size fit all, and it's certainly not easy. But a lot of the books and the shows and everything out there try to make it sound easy. I mean, it's like, we'll just do this and everything will change. And it's just not, that's just simply not true. So I really am on this pursuit to understand what really works. I'm on this search, this quest almost as a researcher and trying to learn and understand. So that's what brought me here. That's what led me to you, Alix. And currently you are an organizational effectiveness leader. Tell us more about your background, why you're passionate about it. And the leading question will be, what have been the struggles that you've found to create culture change? And what have been the things that have helped you bridge that gap? So that's the question we'll get to, but start with your background.
Grew up in the family business. My parents started a small property management business shortly before I was born. So got exposure at a very early age as far as like what that looks like, and interacting with lots of different people. It was a really good experience. Started working probably before, the labor laws for minors kicked in. But like I said, it was the family, it was a good experience.
And what were the properties that they managed?
Yeah, just, kind of your typical like, there were apartment buildings, but then there were also houses. Like I grew up in, a city of like 50,000 people in La Crosse. So like not La Crosse, Wisconsin. So like not a big city, right?
Okay.
And so really like, owners who they had like personal relationships with
Gotcha.
and yeah, so still small property management
Yeah.
business. And my brother's actually doing a lot of it now, but that's kind of where I got my start. And then, I kind of fell into retail while I was in undergrad and was fortunate enough to be told, hey, like, you're one of our best salespeople. Why don't you start training all the people and, and bringing, training them, onboarding, and then, going to recruiting. So I ended up working for a couple different companies in the retail space. So I did retail for about 6 years. From where I started, I had transferred to New York City to another store and then got recruited over to another different retailer to actually open up a large store. You'll hear a lot of like building in my background. And then from there, I actually went to a school that was just, get the basics of what I was doing in HR. And then from there, went to a cybersecurity professional services firm, led really kind of like learning, engagement, those types of organizational strategies. And then from there, went to a startup, a lottery manager, which was a really cool experience. I was actually hired by the parent company before the business entity even existed. So again, builder, I like kind of just navigating ambiguity, which, talk about leading, right? I mean, it's not easy. It's something I love to do, but it forces a lot of challenges your way. And then from there, actually decided to take a step back from HR or development, and did change management consulting for Workday implementations. But the company that I was at, I kept getting pulled into a lot of conversations related to my background. So something I didn't mention is my degrees, my bachelor's and my master's are in, as far as the primary major, African-American studies. And so cultural studies, like, understanding diversity has always been kind of a lens through which I think about HR or design development. And so helped, really kind of get the D&I Council off the ground, ended up applying for leading the global DEI function. So that was my last internal role. And then from there, actually, I've been consulting ever since. So really passionate about systems. You need the training too, right? People need to know how to do it. But if the systems don't support effective training, if the systems don't support leaders, just, forget even the training piece, just, doing their day to day and really kind of, if there's not alignment, right? It's not going to be successful. Yeah.
So here's a plug, question for you. I like that how you told me just sort of the whole when you started working and the growth there. I was thinking as you were talking, when was it that you first started to pay attention to this idea of culture in a workplace? When did you start to notice that that's important and why?
I would say retail, right?
Mm.
Retail is a tough one because, and I only did field retail. So I was like on the ground in the stores, right? Dealing with all the things you can imagine going on in, a store of 400, employees. Just kind of realized that there is so much to the experience because, people could say, oh, I could find a retail employee anywhere, right? It's not like a, very kind of skilled, position. And a lot of people do it like I did, like while you're in school, right? It's not like a career necessarily. It's just kind of a side gig, especially on the field side, right? But just seeing the value and the impact of even just little things. I mean, I think a huge piece of it was having a boss who was very passionate about it, spoke about it a lot. And it was the first time I'd ever seen someone who, when just thinking about just as an employee side, like, do I really even matter to this retail company? Right. Like I'm one of how many associates, but like, to know, like he made it very clear how much he valued every single person there. So that was a really great kind of role model for it. And then with the little things, I'll never forget, I literally can like picture when this happened. And this was several years ago. I'd recently onboarded a cohort and I see one of the people working the floor and I said, hey, and said their name, how's everything going? And they stopped and said, I think you might be the only person in this whole place that knows my name. And I wasn't showing off that I knew their name. To me, it's just, well, of course I would know your name. Like why wouldn't I bother to know your name? And that's something that stuck with me. And I remember like the next, even far beyond retail, right? Like the next, company I went to, like people would notice, wow, you know everybody's name. Yeah. Yeah. And not just because I work in HR, like that, I want to know everyone's name. And I will say, while I was in grad school, I taught as an assistant in a kindergarten classroom. And let me tell you, kids will not let you forget their name. They will hold you accountable. So it was also a good lesson there. But yeah, I mean, it's such a small thing, but it's so big.
Yeah.
And it just goes to feeling seen, feeling like you matter. So that's kind of at the smallest scale, right? And the broader scale is, not just that my boss would very much show recognition and bother to kind of, see how everyone was doing, but really keeping that pulse on engagement and taking the next step to actually do something about it, especially in such a, the type of industry.
Yeah, well, there's two ways to remember someone's name, right? One way would be sort of a self-motivated way of I want people to think that I'm great and I want people to think I'm a good leader and I want people to, I want to be that, want to be this, I want to be that. And it kind of starts with me. And the other way is just like and you said it, I want this person to feel like they matter. And the difference is clearly felt. We had, when I was running a leadership institute, actually write about this individual in my book because it's extraordinary how well he is at building relationships, but it starts with just how he addresses individuals and how he remembers their name. And he's a leader in multiple capacities. He's a CEO of a company that spans across multiple states. He sits on boards. He's a religious leader as well in his faith outside of work, community leader. So he's somebody that meets a lot of people, sees a lot of people, comes across a lot of names, but he makes a point to remember them. And I'll never forget how intentional he was. We had him come and speak to one of our cohorts. He was in our very first cohort ever. And then a couple of years later, we had him come back and speak. And we had a group of about 25, 30 leaders, right? So not a lot. But before, anytime we had somebody come and speak, like if you're coming, I would send you bios of everybody that was going to be there and headshots and everything, but just so that you get a feel for the group, right?
Yeah.
I've never had anybody do this, right? So he shows up and before we start, they're mingling, he's getting to know a few people. And then he starts going and he starts addressing people by name and starts talking about things specifically about them And I'm like, oh well, that's just Brian. Like he probably met these people when we were small talking before the engagement started, and like he sparked up a conversation with them. But he was doing this with multiple people, and I'm like, how did he make his rounds that? I mean, we only had 10 minutes before this started. Like he met with this many people, but I'm thinking that's Brian. He remembers that sort of stuff. After the session, he had left, and we're kind of moving on to the next part of our day. All these participants come up to me, and they're like, how do you know my name? And they're talking to each other like, have you met him before? And there was just this moment where they're pointing at each other like, how did he know our names? And I was like, oh guys, I thought he had spent time with you before. And then it occurred to me, I'm like, oh, we send bios out. Like we do that with all of our speakers. They were all, this was their words, not mine. They said, he was talking to me like he knew exactly who I was. Like felt so personal. And that's just Brian, like as busy as he is with as many things as he has going on, he took the time and intentional enough to actually sit down, memorize faces and names and bios, and then use them like he was their friend. I mean, and he makes you feel like you're one of his best friends. And that's a quality that I don't have. I'm not great with names, and that's something I'd like to work on. But I like that you brought that up, because the small things really matter, especially in, like you're saying, and you started in retail, very fast paced. My dad was in retail his whole career, and it's very fast paced. There's always something going on, and so it's not always an easy thing to do. It's not like you sit in an office, cubicles next to each other, and you get to kind of have banter and hang out. I mean, retail, you're on the ground doing things all the time. It's not the same sort of environment as if I'm working in an office with somebody. So
Yeah.
it definitely, I can imagine, goes a longer way there. I love that example.
Yeah, it's funny, as you were talking, I think it's, even if it's not the names thing, right? I think it is just that feeling of when they talk to me, I would say, as a leader, right? Like I, as a leader, when I talk to you, you feel like it's not just, okay, how's everything going? Okay, check off the list. Like it's very like, oh, how are you doing? How are you? Like I know you've had this going on.
It's not a token nicety. It's not just like I'm doing this to be nice. Yeah.
And it's showing that you want the real answer.
Yeah. So how do you do that? Let's dive into that. It's so much easier said than done. How do you do that?
And look, I'm not saying, I'm the expert on this.
Well, and even if you want to just speak in general, like how have you helped people do that? Because that's a big part of culture, is to get people to genuinely care about those that they work with. How do you do that?
Let me give you an example of a position I went into where I kind of walked into a scenario where there wasn't maybe inherent trust. Oh, leading DEI, there were concerns about my perspective, not because of anything I said or did, but just because, is a white person capable of truly being able to understand and not center themselves. I didn't realize we were going to go this deep on this podcast, but here we are. So,
hey, this is beneath the transaction. We got to go deep right away. We don't want to float around on the surface. Those are easy.
Yes. And the reasoning, it was incredibly valid. I want to make sure that's out there, right? I don't want anyone to interpret this as I can't believe people were judging based on identity. Like there were a lot of dynamics going on. I'll kind of just add that caveat. And at the end of the day, in a position like that, the onus is on the person in that position, no matter whether it's about identity or not, to like earn trust, right? I mean, that is really any people related, should be any leader, but I think that one especially, you have so much impact and so much power as it relates to people who are already, historically marginalized. So, how can you kind of truly understand and address what's going on? And I think the biggest thing is, because when you think about scale, right? Everyone I'm talking to doesn't report to me directly. They don't have any accountability to me. But I have accountability to everybody. So, when they are, when they have their concerns, instead of running away, let's get time on the calendar. Let's talk. I will talk to you as many times as it takes. Right. And of course, I'm going to show action too. It's not just about talking. I'm so fast paced. It's something that I'm working on. I'm so fast paced that I can give the impression that I I don't want to have more of an in-depth conversation, or I'm just trying to get things done. And so I try to be, very intentional about how I approach the conversation, how I'm showing up. I make sure that I don't have something scheduled right afterward, right? Where I'm trying to like rush right away.
So a lot of intentionality around it.
A lot of intentionality. And I think the bigger piece is through that conversation, just listening to the other person, hearing them. I think it's, the whole notion of validating their feelings, which is separate from agreement, right? And it could be agreement, but helping them just understand why I'm here, where I'm coming from on this. Tell me your concerns. Don't be afraid that I'm going to receive it in a certain way or I'm going to be offended. No, like let's have a real conversation. And I think you have to get through the friction, right? To get there, to really have that depth. But I think what a lot of people would say about me is that I am willing to have those in-depth conversations. I'm willing to, put my ego, identity, any of that stuff to the side. Even something I can't control, that's okay. Like, let's talk about it. Like, what is the concern behind it?
Yeah. So,
right?
so in those moments, what's we'll call it kind of your psychological self-talk that you have with yourself in the moments where, like you said, you kind of set it up, right? You're in this position. There obviously there could be, or maybe there was concerns. Here you are talking about diversity, so on. You're white, you're Caucasian. Now people are coming into your office. How do you get these self-justifying images of yourself out of the way of worrying like, I have something to prove to them. I need to prove to them that I can do X, Y, that I'm X, Y, and Z. Where there's still this sort of self-driven focus. How do you talk to yourself to get out of that state and fully be present with the other? In fact, what you think of yourself no longer matters in this moment because now you're really focused on them. That's a hard thing to do. How have you found moving past that? And because I found that, and I'll get into this after, but I found that the choice to do these things is a key part of culture transformation, but it's very difficult, right? It's not an easy thing to do. So I'd love to hear how did you mentally handle that and psychologically kind of, I don't want to make this about me. I don't, because if a lot of people in your shoes would have the fear of needing to come off a certain way, needing to say certain things a certain way, having to prove something to them. How did you just let go of those things and hold on to the present with them in the moment?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, I've been incredibly fortunate to, I mentioned my undergrad and grad degrees, right? Where, look, I came in at 18 years old, typical white Midwesterner, like I didn't know how to have conversations about race. I didn't know how to navigate any of that. But through, my coursework and obviously, having more of an understanding of the broader world and, just kind of like deeper analysis around psychology related to it. And then just really incredible conversations with my professors, right? Who always said, no, you have a perspective, you have a viewpoint, and realizing though there's a way to add value to a conversation while still knowing that like, no, I have this identity. I know that informs the way that I see things and not being scared to admit that, right? So, and I think more broadly applicable to any leadership role for anything like outside of DEI, I think it's, just knowing that if you come in, that intentionality, try to plan for conversations, practice the conversations. If nothing else, don't avoid the conversations, right? It always gets better on the other side and the connections that you can form. Some of my strongest connections are because we had major conflict and we worked through it, right? A lot of people use the term like personality conflict. I don't believe in that. I believe that you might not be best friends, but I believe that you can work with anyone if you put in the work, right? And to my story earlier about just having those conversations to build trust, so I'm finishing up my PhD program. My dissertation is on building trust in diverse teams. And the academic definition of trust, I'm paraphrasing, is basically, the willingness to be vulnerable with another person because of that expectation of follow through, right? Vulnerability is a literal requirement of trust. And so kind of keeping that in mind. And I think, to get to your specific question around kind of how did I like not take it personally, right? Like how did I kind of separate myself from that is because at the end of the day, it wasn't personal. They weren't, even if they do use judgmental words, at the end of the day, the conversation is to dig into where is this coming from, right? Because I have faith in my intentions. I don't need to prove, me saying I had good intentions actually makes things worse because then you're not owning your impact, right? You can have all the good intentions in the world. And I know it doesn't make me a bad person if maybe I screwed up here and there, right? And I didn't say the right thing or I came across this way. But anyone I've interacted with, no matter if they had vastly different personality, background, whatever it is, if you own it, right? You talk through it and you are clear on how it could have, been approached better. I mean, you get to grow from it. What a gift, right? Like conflict, it can be a gift that like, oh my God, I got to learn one more thing about myself. And hopefully they learned one more thing. And they found out there are people who look like me who can have these conversations and they can still feel heard, So
Yeah.
It's not easy. I won't say it's easy every time. I mean, it is a lifelong educational piece, but that would be a huge thing I would tell leaders is separate the personal, even if it feels like a judgment, that's your ego talking, just keep getting to the root, keep getting to the impact, the outcomes.
Yeah.
And that's where you'll really make progress.
Yeah. Vulnerability and conflict are so closely related. And I'm remembering now what we had spoken about a few weeks ago offline, because you brought up, I'm glad you brought up your dissertation and your research and about vulnerability and trust. Because one of the 7 conditions of transformation that I kind of dove into, and the result of a lot of my research and my dissertation was trying to figure out what really creates transformation. There was 7 things that appeared consistently, and one of them was vulnerability. And it was actually, out of all of our data collection, vulnerability was ranked the highest above all as a key element to transformation. And it's not because it's more important than the other conditions, right? Purpose, commitment, common language, building deep and trusting relationships, consistency, safe space. Like those are all these conditions that we discovered. And there's vulnerability. It's not that it's more important. It's just that typically when vulnerability is present, and you can share your thoughts on this too after, but typically when vulnerability is there and it's in the room and it's in the space, on the other side of it is usually a visceral manifestation of some kind of transformation. I mean, almost every time. And the way that I write about it in the book, our chapter on vulnerability, it's actually, I call it opening the door that fear tells us to keep shut. And when that door finally opens, there's usually some transformational moment that can occur. And the reason why it's so closely related, in my belief, to conflict is because conflict, when we're afraid, when we have fear, we typically want to run or fight, right? Fight or flight. And those are styles of conflict, avoidance or competing, 2 of probably the most dominant styles of conflict that people have. People are either going to compete or they're going to avoid. And there's compromising and collaboration and things of that nature. But in my experience, most people, when they face conflict, they're going to run away from it or they're going to fight it. And that just escalates conflict. So that's, in my belief, why it's so connected to vulnerability, because vulnerability is the thing that we are afraid of. And if we just open that door, we start to let go of, like you said, ego. We start to let go of a lot of things. And on the other side of it, there's usually a newfound relationship that's on the other side, a self-discovery, a collective discovery. And so when we gathered this data and we interviewed all these leaders and these people, and they talked about vulnerability as a part of their experience with transformation, it was because what was on the other side of it was such a powerful and memorable moment for them. And one example that even has to do with diversity, we had one of our leadership cohorts, and we'd always start, it's 12 months long, but we'd always start with a retreat, and we'd bring everybody out to the coast of Oregon, and we'd spend 3 days together. And we were very intentional in getting leaders from 5 different sectors: government, business, education, nonprofit, and faith community. And we did our best to try to sort of surface level diversity of gender, ethnicity, things of that. We did our best to do that, but you can't always control it because people applied for this and they were nominated. We always did our best. So we had this group of leaders, and that particular year we had another foundation from the Midwest actually that came out to see what we were doing because they wanted to do the same sort of thing in their community. And they sat through this whole experience. It was really amazing, transformative. We made these retreats really, intentionally emotional and deep and powerful, and people really open up, and it was, great experience. But at the end, my favorite part is always biggest takeaways. We spend like 3 hours doing biggest takeaways. And one of these foundation leaders, Frank, he's from the Caribbean, he's African American, and he stands up and he listened to all these leaders, and he got super vulnerable. And this is an example of what's on the other side of vulnerability. He only listened to, there was only about 5 or 6 people that shared before him, and then he shared, and it actually opened the door for a lot of other people to open up. But he stands up and, he was sitting in the back. He said, I have to apologize to all of you guys here. I showed up and I looked around the room and I leaned over to one of his colleagues, Brandon, who's also Black. And he said, this isn't a very diverse group. There's only 2 other Black people in the room, right? Like, that's what he said. He said, that's what I leaned over and said to Brandon. But then he has tears now welling up in his eyes. And he says, I sat through 3 days with all of you and heard your stories and heard your backgrounds and got to know all of you. And this is one of the most diverse groups that I've ever been able to be a part of. And I just want to apologize to all of you that I was actually sitting here judging you 3 days ago. And that vulnerability that he displayed, I mean, after that, the sharing just opened up. And when people talk to me about vulnerability, and the participants that year, as I was gathering data, some of them went back to that very moment when Frank shared that thing, that was a moment where they felt him being vulnerable, and it opened the door for them to now share. And then people were sharing all sorts of things, discoveries that they were making personally in some of their own relationships with their at home and X, Y, and Z. But just a small gesture of vulnerability goes a long way, because it just gets rid of that fear that people tend to put up, those walls that disconnect us. And that was why it was a clear condition of transformation. In fact, I mean, without vulnerability, it's just not going to happen. Transformation won't happen. There won't be those sort of discoveries, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think it also speaks to at the same time, with vulnerability, kind of getting back to the conversations around kind of working through conflict. It's, that, you're feeling seen, like he realized, like, okay, like, yeah, each of us are more than the sum of our parts, right? There's so many different things that make us different. I do want to say, like, at the lowest, I mean, I think it's always a win when leaders recognize that a room isn't diverse. You kind of started with one perspective, but then being able to shift the perspective is really helpful. And when you think about transformations, it's always about getting to the root cause. And that's what he was able to do by hearing all of their stories. We're digging in. And so everyone's clear on the why, because we have the root cause. We've actually had the deeper conversations to get there. So a little bit more indirect, but that was something that kind of came to mind, those few different things as you were talking.
Yeah. Well, here's another thing that I found too, just being in these spaces where transformation was occurring. And to be frank, some of these moments were so vulnerable and powerful. I'm actually confident that not a lot of other communities got to this level of depth, where complete strangers, would come together and have these moments. They were so special. And other things just stopped mattering. I mean, people didn't care at that point about, do we have all the, the right people in the room? I mean, all of the checklists that we have of what we have to do, what we're told to do, just went away. And people were just present with each other and their humanity. And it was so powerful. And that's a hard thing to tap into, because we have so many demands. Leaders have so many pressures in their own organizations. And then in a community on top of that, coming together in a community, trying to solve some of our community challenges, whether it's in education, with our homeless population, whatever the case is, there's so many pressures, there's so many expectations. But these leaders kept finding ways, with intentionality behind it, systematically. That's why I like you said that at the beginning. But they kept finding ways to break through everything else, to where they were focused on the humanity of each other in the room and the people that they all had an impact on in their own community and their organizations. In my opinion, that's so rare. You don't see that a whole lot. We get so fixated on the surface, like a weed in the ground. We focus on what we can see, but the roots are so deep. And, an analogy to a conflict, I mean, if we just keep weed whacking at the top, the weed's going to keep coming back. And it's not till we dig into the soil and get to those roots that we start to make progress. And that's what we were finding. But I like that you've brought up trust and vulnerability, because both of those elements were key conditions to transformation. And I just found when people got there, it opened up the doors to so many new relationships, new ideas, just new space. It was really incredible.
I think it's a comprehensive lens of what accountability is, right? In our day to day, we get so focused on P&L and, all the numbers, and those are important. But how you reach those is at least really, I would say, more important, the how. And, I think where a lot of leaders realize is they get so kind of laser focused on those numbers. If they realize that the effort, where they really spend their time, so much of it, nearly all of it really should be the relational piece. And, especially at a senior leader level, who are, execution is through your people. It's not through, you shouldn't be doing execution really at that level.
Yeah.
So so that, like I said, that comprehensive view of accountability. And, but part of that, though, is leaders have to have identified their own values, because they should do it in a way that's authentic to them. The way I approach it is not going to be the same as you or any other leader.
Yeah.
And, employees can pick up on that real quick. If if it's not coming from a place, if it's like I learned at this workshop, okay, here's my checklist. I got to do this thing, then this thing. That's never going to really inspire people. But find a way to do it in a way that works for you. I taught organizational leadership to master's students in IO psychology last semester. We had a lot of conversations because they really gravitated to authentic leadership.
Yeah.
But really, then it was well, what does that mean to you? You know what I mean? And kind of surfacing those definitions and helping them understand their own values and what they look for in a leader, what they have accountability for as a follower.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it was really good conversation.
That's such a great point of, it's going to be different because it's going to come from the individual, right? And that's why there's no sort of easy blueprint for it, because it's going to look different. What may work for one person over here isn't going to work for the next over there. And that's the challenge, but that's also the beauty.
Yeah.
And I like that you're talking about accountability kind of holistically. How would you define accountability?
That's an excellent question. Here I spent months asking people to define trust, and everyone being oh yeah, I guess I've never thought about the actual definition. I think less about the, there's, I'm sure, a technical definition. For me, it's why are you even here if not to have some level of accountability to the role that you have, and that's so much more than your title. I mean, like I said, my last internal role, I felt a deep intrinsic commitment to the people of the organization. Of course, and we did have incredible results, right? It helped the bottom line too. And, we could show those stats. But at the end of the day, conversations I had where people said things like, thank you for creating a safe space for me. Thank you for just being someone that I feel like I can just talk to without impression management. It didn't say those words, but those kind of things. And I think, or even just the actions, right? You just see them feeling more empowered to speak up. Or, a Muslim woman in a previous organization, she hadn't been wearing her hijab, and then suddenly she started wearing it. And it was just it was so powerful. She didn't need to say anything. You were okay, she feels safe to kind of be fully who she is. And I think picking up on that, right? And at the same time, picking up on the signals that they're not feeling it. And so that accountability is that check-in, right? It's why are you even here? What are you really committing to here? What does your role mean? And how are you communicating that? So, does that capture what you were thinking with, kind of really defining accountability?
Yeah, it's a tricky one to define. And it's largely because we want to have it fit into the idea of accountability. Most leaders want it to fit into this box that has to do with simply, the metrics and the numbers, and we holding people accountable, right? And we want to think about it that way. But working with so many leaders over the years, I've just discovered that accountability is, deeper than that. For our last few minutes, I want to kind of share an example, a story with you, and get your your insight, before we close. And I think it touches on a lot of things because the overarching question today was, right, what are the challenges in creating culture change and then what really works? And I feel like we've really gotten into that when we're talking about trust, vulnerability. You've even mentioned, safe space. We've talked about these really important elements. And from my perspective, these are conditions for transformation. I mean, it's what I'm writing about in my book, Beneath the Transactions. So you're naturally already talking about the same things that I've discovered in a completely different
Yeah.
area, in a completely different community, because I think they're timeless principles. I feel like we've addressed that. I've just thought of an example, a story that I want to share with you, and I'd love your perspective because it really touches on a lot of these pieces: vulnerability, trust, definitely on accountability, and even this idea that you've mentioned. And obviously, we don't have the time to go into it in depth, but diversity and how do we handle those conversations. And so I'll share this story and then I want to get your thoughts. So when I was a kid, and this story is actually in my book, it's actually, I think, in the chapter on commitment, which is the second condition of transformation in the book. And I actually related a lot to accountability, which is why I want to bring this up. And to me, what I've found is a couple things about accountability. Just an idea about it is leaders ought to spend their time creating accountable people instead of holding people accountable. So that's one idea. But how I've defined it is accountability is being the first to change. That's what it means. And if you have an organization where everyone is willing to be the first to change, you have an accountable organization. But then what about when we shouldn't have to change? What if it really is somebody else? Then I actually call that deep accountability, being willing to change even when we have every reason not to. If you fill your organization with people that think that way, you're going to do amazing things. And I first learned this lesson from my dad when I must have been, I don't know, 9, 10 years old. My dad's from the islands. He's from the Philippines, came to the country, as a young adult. And he worked at Ross Dress for Less growing up. He was a manager at Ross. So my mom, I'm the youngest of 5, and I was out running errands with my mom. She had to drop me off because she was going to go run more errands. She dropped me off. My dad was almost done with his shift. So he knew I was there. She dropped me off. I'm sitting on a bench inside of Ross, just waiting, right? He comes and tells me, "Hey, Chris, give me a few minutes. I need to wrap things up and then we'll go." So he goes, to the back where the offices are, and I'm just hanging out in the front of the store. As I'm waiting, the doors open and this woman comes through, very upset. She's holding some item in her hand, like, a return item. She's just frustrated. A lot of colorful language, a lot of emotion. And she goes to the desk and she's just demanding in that moment with customers. There's a line of people. She doesn't care. She just butts in front and she's like, she needs this to be addressed. So she demands to speak with a manager. And so they intercom my dad. His name's Bong, Bong. So they ask him, Bong, to come down. And in Ross, usually they're pretty much the same. You have one big central aisle or two big central aisles, right? And the offices are always in the back. So there's one big central aisle in this store. And so they call him down and so he starts to make his way down this big aisle and she sees him and she just rolls her eyes and puts her head back. And when he approaches, before he even gets but 2 or 3 words out, she says, "I want to speak to somebody who speaks English." And my dad responds, I speak. He's obviously got a thick accent and he doesn't speak perfect English, but he speaks great enough English. And I remember as a little kid feeling frustrated, like, why is she talking to my dad this way? Like, what a jerk, right? And so I'm frustrated that she's treating him this way. And he starts to try to address this. And Filipino people are very happy. They're always smiling. So he's got a big smile on his face. He's happy. He's trying to resolve this. I could tell he's uncomfortable. I know my dad, I looked at his face. I could tell he's obviously uncomfortable with this, but he's handling it with poise. And she gets so mad. Eventually she gets her finger and she puts it right in his face. And she says, "I want you to go back to where you came from." And that was the first time in my life where I had ever, witnessed something like that and felt in my heart hatred. I mean, I remember as a kid, 10 to 12, I can't remember exact age, feeling such anger. I mean, my knuckles were white and I'm about to stand up. And in my little kid mind, I was going to charge this woman. Like I was going to charge at her. I was so mad that she was treating, my dad, who's really a hero of mine, who's amazing, this way. And as I'm about to stand up, he glances over at me and looks at me with father's eyes, like, "It's okay. Like everything's going to be okay, son." Doesn't have to say anything to me. He just gives me that look. So I sit down and he resolves this situation and she gets whatever she needed. And she's still frustrated, but she leaves. And I'm just perplexed by this. My little brain doesn't know how to handle it. And then I was even more frustrated after, because after this, he comes over to me and tells me, "Hey, I'm going to grab my things and we'll go." It's like nothing, it's like he was fine. And then the whole store, like all these customers and employees didn't do anything. I thought one of them
Yeah.
needed to go out in the parking lot and like give this woman a piece of their mind. Like, I was so mad that nobody said anything to my dad. Nobody said anything to me. Nobody went out and chased this woman down. So I'm so upset, like emotionally upset, holding back tears. Like I've just never been so angry before in my life. And he goes and gets his stuff. He comes back. He says, "All right, let's go." We go out in the parking lot. We're walking. I'm thinking finally he's going to tell me. Finally, he's going to tell me how he really feels. Nothing. We get in the car. I think, okay, now we're really in private. Now he's going to tell me what he really thinks. Nothing. We're driving home and I can't hold it back anymore. I just explode. Tears coming down my face. And I get maybe 2 to 3 sentences out. And I called this woman every bad word that I could think of and that I knew that was inappropriate, but I thought was warranted for the situation. And he's driving and he just pulls the car quickly, abruptly to the side of the road, hits the brakes. And my dad is a very gentle person, but he looks at me sternly in the eyes and he tells me, "Chris, stop. I don't ever want to hear you say those things about another person ever again." He says, "I'm sorry that you had to see that, but you have to understand a couple of things, son. That woman is somebody else's mother. She's somebody else's daughter. She probably has kids. She's probably married. Chris, you have a mom and you have sisters. Would you ever want anybody to say what you're saying about them?" And I was floored, right? I shook my head, tears coming down my eyes. "No, Dad." He said, "Look, some people are going to do what they want to do. And the most that we can do is love them." And then he got back on the road and we went home. And I didn't understand in the moment the lesson he was teaching me. I don't even know if he did, but he taught me some valuable lessons. One really quick one, he taught me, he could have created such strong bias in my mind. He could have supported negative stereotypes, but he didn't. And he actually flipped them completely. But the most valuable thing that I've learned from that was this idea of deep accountability, because there's one person in this whole story that did not need to change, and it was my dad. He did not deserve that. He deserved people to stand up for him. Nobody did. He didn't deserve to be spoken to that way. And he didn't deserve a son to be upset at him about it. And he was not in a position to hold this woman accountable. He was not in a position to hold these bystanders accountable, but he was in a position to help me understand this idea that we can only choose for ourselves. And that's, to me, deep accountability is being the first to change, even when we have every reason not to. And what a ripple effect that creates for generations. I'm going to tell that story to my kids and they're going to tell it to theirs. And that lesson will live on far longer, far longer than anything else that he could have done. So there's a lot of layers to this story, a lot of dynamics, right? But I'd love your thoughts as we've talked about trust, vulnerability, accountability. To close, I mean, that's my lesson in this story. And obviously you're hearing it from me, but I'm sure that you had other thoughts. I'd love to get your takeaways from that and from our entire conversation on what are some final things that we need to be really in tune with to break through the transactional culture and really start to make change.
Yeah. So a few things came to mind. First, kind of before you sharing your personal story, kind of the definition that you had, to me, it's a growth mindset, right? Like you have a duty as a leader to not only have a growth mindset yourself and role model it, but to foster it in others, right? And I think when we think about conflict in the workplace and out, it's, it resonates with the story you shared is we can't let people get into a mindset of a zero-sum game. If one person wins, the other person must lose. I mean, he really showed a lot of leadership in that moment for, many different reasons. And when you think about the bystander piece, that's where culture is so important, right? Like, if we had had a culture where it was almost like habitual, like, of course, you're going to stand up, you're going to have, policies is probably too strong of a word, but just norms, right? And dealing with customers like that. And, saying, no, the customer's not always right. Like if they are disrespecting our employees, it's unacceptable. No matter where the disrespect comes from, we're not tolerating that. So that's one of the things that comes to mind as well. And I think, obviously it's an awful story and at the same time, it's too common even still, right? And I think that the more we as leaders can improve ourselves, keep that growth mindset, and know that others can change. I worked with leaders who, when I first started talking with them, whew, the defenses were up. Like first conversation, literally I'm just like, okay, here are your stats. Or are you saying that, I'm not looking for, I'm not, yeah, I'm just looking for the best qualified candidate, whatever it is, right? Like there's no accusations here. Let's just talk about it, right? Let's talk about like, where there might be gaps. Like, let's just have a conversation, instead of jumping to the accusations. If nothing else, right? Leading with assuming positive intention and, assuming that no one wants to be an evil jerk, even though there are plenty of people who probably do. I don't know if you ever heard about, and anyone spiritual knows this, right? When you think about forgiveness isn't for the other person, it's for you.
Yeah.
And I think about that the same way with assuming positive intention. If I go into a conversation assuming this is a terrible person, is that going to be a productive conversation? No, right? But if I go in assuming, maybe I saw them on their worst day and we're going to have a conversation, maybe things won't change in this conversation. We're going to keep having conversations until they do. And, just continually that intentionality, right? Just continuing, if you can leave with anything today, have the conversation anyway.
Yeah.
Even if you don't know exactly how to have it, you don't have, all the answer, have the conversation anyway.
Yeah.
You never know what you'll connect on and what you'll learn from it.
Yeah. That's powerful. Part of vulnerability, right? Just being vulnerable is having the conversation anyways, right? Because those fears are going to hold us back of, I don't know what to say. What if I do this? What if I do that? And fear typically, not all the time, but it's typically self-focused, right? We can fear for other people, obviously, but getting rid of that really opens up potential and opportunities, and the conversations go differently. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, this has been a fun conversation, and I've loved hearing your journey and the things that have stuck out to you as you've been intentional, because that was another word that we talked about today. And I think that's a key piece in all of this. As you found in your intention, these conditions of transformation. Now, maybe you weren't calling them though that like I am, but you've discovered a lot of the same key principles. And that's reinforcing selfishly for my pursuit of discovery. But I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation as I have, and learn from one another, iron sharpening iron, and just improving every day. And because culture, it's just not an easy it's not an easy thing to change. A lot of cultures probably need it in organizations everywhere, and it's just a hard thing to do. It's not as easy as just punching in new numbers and you get a better result. It's very
We're slapping values on a wall.
Yeah.
And I mean, with that accountability piece, hold yourself accountable to know everyone's story, because that's how you get to being able to lead the change and foster change in others.
Yeah. Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is from Henry Longfellow. He said, if we knew the secret history of even our greatest enemies, we would find in them enough humanity and suffering to disarm all of our hostility towards them.